All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. For those of you I haven't met yet or you haven't seen me kick these off, I'm Andrea Lamoureux. I'm the Vice President of New Hampshire Lakes, and this is the third session in our Working for Clean and Healthy Lakes webinar. And I'm super excited to have the experts, the biologists from Department of Environmental Services in the house tonight. But just wanted to go over a few things before we turn it over to Dave and Kirsten. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded. Participants, you will be muted for the duration just because we're expecting a lot of you, and it would be a big party if we were all able to chime in. If you do choose to leave your camera on, just remember that others can see you. During the presentation, feel free to submit questions or comments in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and Crystal or myself or one of our co-attendees will respond or try to help you. Again, Crystal and I will try to answer your questions as the presentation goes on, but those really tough questions we're going to save for the experts at the end. And I know Dave and Kirsten are going to try to leave some Q&A time at the end. After this session this evening around 8:15, you'll receive an email from us asking you to provide a simple evaluation, what you liked about the session, what we could have done better, and things you want to learn about in the future. And then tomorrow morning, you will receive an email from me with links to the recording of this and the slides on our website. Again, technical issues, type that into the chat box and someone will try to help you. So again, I'm Andrea Lamoureux. Crystal Costa Balanoff is our Conservation Program Coordinator. She's on the call tonight and again is our tech guru and also will help answer questions. And our Jessica, our Conservation Program Coordinator, may join us at some point. So for those of you who are not familiar with New Hampshire Lakes, we are sponsoring this series, bringing in experts from the different areas of the state. We are the only member-supported nonprofit organization working for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. And we do hope that if you're not a member, please consider joining us, help support our work. And if you are a member, thank you. We could not do this work. We could not have outreach programs like this without your support and enthusiasm. So thank you. Our mission, again, for those of you who are new to us, is simply to keep our lakes clean and healthy now and in the future. And we work with partners, we promote clean water policies, and hopefully inspire the public to take good care of our lakes so that we can all enjoy them. Our programs, we do advocacy at the state level. Some of you may know us through our premier Lake Host program or Aquatic Invasive Species Education and Prevention Program. We have a new program that we've been getting out, the Lake Smart Lake Friendly Living Program, which has a direct impact on good water quality, good lake health. And we do outreach, usually throughout the state during the summer with families at family-friendly events. This year we've shifted gears a little bit and developed this webinar series as our outreach tactics. So again, if you have been tuning into these series, thank you. If you've missed any or want to watch any of them again, they're posted on our website. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to one of my longtime colleagues and friends, Dave Niels, Chief Aquatic Biologist with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and Kirsten Nelson, Aquatic Ecologist at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And are you, Kirsten or Dave, able to share yours, or do you want me to pull?
Hi, Andrea. I can share mine.
Perfect.
Are you seeing a presentation?
We are, and you looks
Excellent.
perfect. You're in presentation mode. Take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Dave Niels. I'm the Chief Aquatic Biologist at the Department of Environmental Services. I'm very happy to have an opportunity to provide a presentation to you tonight. You're not going to get to listen to me for the entire time. Actually, the majority of the time, I'm going to yield to my colleague, Kirsten Nelson. But again, I want to thank you guys all for sharing your evening with me. I think, you know, we're in a very unique situation. And what I've noticed is that people have really grown to appreciate the outdoors more this year, which is fantastic. And one of the things that we have here in the state, which is one of our best resources is about 1,000 lakes. So people have, really got to know those lakes pretty well, and that's really great. And it just stresses the importance of keeping our lakes clean and healthy. So what I'd like to do tonight is give a little introduction, and then I'm going to turn things over to Kirsten. So away we go. So just to show you our path of wandering tonight, I'll start with just a little overview of our surface water quality monitoring strategy, and that's kind of how we get to the point of being able to provide reports on the condition of our lakes and ponds or rivers and streams. And then one thing that I think is really important and that we know a lot of folks out there do is participate as volunteers. So that's fantastic. I'd also like to spend just a little bit of time giving you an update on what we're doing this summer in terms of our monitoring efforts during the pandemic. It has been quite challenging for us. And then that's going to be all that you really hear from me. Then I'm going to turn things over to Kirsten. She's going to give us an idea of the outcomes from the analysis of the lake data. And then, of course, she's smart and she'll synthesize all that for us. And then what I really like to do is wrap up after about 40 minutes and then provide about 20 minutes or so, if we can, of Q&A and have a nice lively Q&A session. So the title of the talk tonight is How Healthy Are Our Lakes? That is actually a really challenging question for us to answer. I know it seems like it should be relatively simple, but if those of you that are volunteers out there, you know that we collect all different types of water quality data. So there's no single measure that really tells us what the health of a lake is. You might have your favorite measure, maybe the Secchi depth or something like that. But there's a whole bunch of things you can use to sort of determine what the health of a lake is. But we really feel lucky in that we have a really well-defined plan at the state of New Hampshire for monitoring our waters, and that's the DES water monitoring strategy. And that's been around since about 2015, and it really focuses our attention on what we do and how we do it. And if you're interested in that water monitoring strategy, there's the link to the bottom, or if you're like me, you just go to Google and you can type in NHDES water monitoring strategy, and that should bring you right to it. So just a little bit more about our water monitoring strategy. Don't get too caught up in this crazy diagram on the left. It's more just pulled out of that document, and what I wanted to do is just stress what the purpose of this strategy is. And really there's three main components, and that is to collect really high quality data, because with bad data you can't do anything. So we focus on collecting really high quality data. And the purpose of that data is to really make water management decisions, one. And then two, to be able to provide products like this, either a webinar or a report, and that is to communicate to the public. So those are the real important purposes of that. The other really critical part of the water monitoring strategy is this sort of bullseye part of the diagram here. And these are our three primary tiers of monitoring that we do at the state of New Hampshire. The one in the center is what we call probability-based monitoring. And if you could think about an opinion poll where you might go out and sample a small portion of the population at random, and then you can extrapolate those results to the entire population. That's what probability sampling is really about. And we do that for lakes and rivers. And if you go to our Watershed Management Bureau website, you can see the report that we've recently published for rivers. We've also just completed the fieldwork component of a probability-based lake monitoring project, and we hope to have a report out on that in the spring of 2021. The next sort of tier is what we call our trend monitoring tier, and that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. Trend monitoring is where you go back to a fixed set of water bodies or water monitoring stations and sample those over time and build that long-term record. So that's really what this data is focused on tonight. The last tier is what we call our synoptic monitoring, and this is where you only sample the water body maybe for 1 or 2 years, and then you move on to a whole different set of water bodies. And the purpose of that is really to maintain a catalog of water quality conditions on various lakes or rivers. We do get a lot of questions to state on specific water bodies, and it certainly is fantastic that we're able to maintain a really comprehensive catalog of water quality data on most of our lakes. So just a plug out there about how the public can participate in lake monitoring. I can't stress how lucky we are in the state of New Hampshire to have such a fantastic group of volunteers that contribute not only a lot of time, but also financial resources. So for instance, there's two sort of flagship water quality monitoring programs for lakes in the state. The first one is the Volunteer Lake Assessment Program, and that's actually what most of the data that Kirsten's going to be talking about tonight is based on. We're not accepting any new lakes into that program, but it's been around for 25 years, I think, right now. And Sarah is listening tonight, so she'll correct me tomorrow if I'm not. Sarah Steiner is the coordinator. She does a fantastic job. There's about 175 lakes in the program. And again, I can't thank the volunteers enough for that work. We also have a sister program that's run by UNH. It's called the Lay Lakes Monitoring Program. They also do a whole bunch of monitoring with, I'd say, about 20 to 30 lakes. They tend to be our bigger water bodies. And the person that coordinates that is Bob Craycraft, and there is his email. So if you're interested in doing some volunteer monitoring right now, Bob would be your guy to contact. We are not accepting any new lakes into the lake assessment or the volunteer lake assessment program at DES. We're just swamped with the number of lakes that we have. And it is really a lot of work. The next sort of, if you're into invasive plants or want to do some invasive plant monitoring, we do have the Weed Watcher program, which is run by Amy Smagula. Again, that's a DES sponsored program. And that provides instruction on how to identify aquatic plants, in particular invasive aquatic plants, and you can then go out and survey for those. And I know that was probably discussed last week when Amy gave her presentation. And then sort of an up and coming thing, although we've known it's been around for a while, is cyanobacteria detection and reporting. We do have a harmful algal bloom program at the state, and the woman that runs that, her name is Amanda McQuaid. She's fantastic. This is a little bit more of an informal program, and it's sort of like surveillance. You can go out to the end of your dock and take a peek at the lake, and that's actually how we get most of the notices of a cyanobacteria bloom in the state of New Hampshire. People call us, and then they can bring in a sample, or we can go out and get it. There is a national program called the Cyanobacteria Monitoring Collaborative that's run by Hillary Snook right here in New England, down in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. Sorry. That is a little bit more formal program and multiple tiers there. So I did leave you the website there, so I would encourage you to go check out that if you're interested. If you're not interested in lakes, we also have opportunities in rivers. The New Hampshire Volunteer River Assessment Program is also an option run by Ted Walsh. So just thought would throw this in very quickly because I figured people might ask us this. We did have quite a bit of change in the way we're doing our monitoring this summer because of the pandemic. It presented a lot of logistic challenges to us. So for those folks that are in VLAP or familiar with VLAP, typically lakes are sampled 3 times in the summer, June, July, and August. This year, because we just logistically was very challenging to get samples in, receive them, sort of to do a contactless exchange of samples and equipment. We dropped that down to 2 sampling events per summer. And I think one of the favorite things that most people have was either the biologist at the state going out to visit the lake, or the volunteers at the lake having the biologist come to visit. Unfortunately, we just didn't want to do that in person, face-to-face work this summer, so we're not doing that. In the state, within our Watershed Management Bureau, we also do what we call lake trophic surveys. They're also lake sampling, a little bit more intensive. And we did not pick up any new lakes for 2020. Again, logistically, it was just a big challenge for us. I talked about synoptic sampling. We do that for rivers. Typically, we do 25 to 30 sites a year. We just canceled that altogether. And then our river trend sampling, we are doing that this summer. That's 40 stations that are sampled each summer, but we're not doing any bacteria samples. And then lastly, importantly too, coastal beach monitoring for fecal bacteria is going on as normal, but typically we would do around 100 freshwater beaches. We're not doing any more than about 12 this summer. So very limited freshwater beach sampling. Overall, our monitoring efforts have really been reduced by about a third. It has been quite a challenge, but I will give a big kudos to the staff. They've worked really hard and doing a great job at carrying out the work that we do have ongoing. So just moving on to what our main event tonight, and this is really focused on a new report that just came out. It's entitled New Hampshire Lake Trend Report, Status and Trends of Water Quality Indicators. The report cover looks like that. It is posted on our website, so I would encourage you to go check that out. You can Google it if you'd like, and that's really what the information that Kirsten's going to talk about is centered around. It's part of this trend monitoring or trend tier that we talk about. It's the first time we've done a report like this, and it's scheduled to be done every 5 years, so keep your eyes open. We hope to keep it up. It relies almost exclusively, as I mentioned before, on volunteer data, and it provides a really nice, robust analysis of lake water quality data on multiple scales, and Kirsten will talk about that. And it's also organized so that you can look at conditions on trends, or on, I'm sorry, on a regional basis, or you could look up in the index where a particular water body stands in terms of its condition. So a huge thank you to all the volunteers that contributed to all this data collection. It's fantastic. And of course, I'm going to give a shout out again to Sarah Steiner, who's our BLAP coordinator. She does a fantastic job. So with that, I'm going to turn my screen and any controls I have over to Kirsten.
All right, can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Okay, so now I just...
Yep, you'll just want to put it into present mode. Going back to your presentation.
Can you see this?
You can see your Zoom screen. Maybe go back to PowerPoint. Yeah, and then just the screen thing down at the bottom, or...
Okay, so it's looking like there's a little bit of a delay.
This is my screen, so I'm attempting to
Got it.
unshare.
Got it.
Oh, okay.
Stop share. There we go.
There we go.
All right, so it's unshared. Does that mean I have it now?
Now you just want to share your screen at the bottom there, Kirsten.
All right. Can everybody see that?
Perfect.
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you for your patience. So yes, I'm going to be talking about the new Lake Trend report. It's hot off the press as of June is when we got it published finally. So you're some of the first people to really be hearing about it. So as Dave mentioned, this report would not have been possible without the Volunteer Lake Assessment Program, or VLAP. It's just an amazing program with about 500 volunteers for approximately 170 lakes around the state. And this program has trained volunteers to collect high quality data. And with these data, we're able to not only make assessments, but also bring the data together into a report like this. So I just really wanted to say a big thank you both to Sarah and to all the volunteers who have really just brought everything together to be able to look at things statewide. So this Lake Trend report took 150 lakes and ponds from the VLAP program and used them in the analysis. The reason we didn't use the full number of VLAP lakes is that we required that lakes provide a minimum of 10 years of data to be included from 1991 to 2018. So these long-term data sets are extremely valuable. They're very time-consuming to build. They're expensive to build. It just, you know, you need to have people who are willing to go out year after year to collect this information. And so again, this is just a huge kudos to all the volunteers who have done so much, and to Sarah too for organizing it all. Really wouldn't have been possible without all that work. So as Dave mentioned, this report was based off of our water monitoring strategy. And this lake trend report looked at a lot of different parameters. So you've got the full list of parameters right here. However, because that would take all night to talk about each one, I'm only going to be talking about 5: chlorophyll A, Secchi depth, specific inductance, total phosphorus, and water temperature. But if you're curious about any of these parameters that I don't talk about, we can certainly discuss them at the end of the presentation, or you can check them out in the report online. So the premise of this talk was, how healthy are our lakes? And as Dave alluded to earlier, this is a really difficult question to answer. It's you'd think that a simple question would have a simple answer, but it's really not. So the 5 parameters we're going to be talking about tonight, you can kind of think of them all as puzzle pieces that come together to show a picture of an overall lake's health. And these 5 parameters go into understanding a lake's health, but there's even more that we won't be talking about tonight, and even more that maybe we didn't even include in the report because we just don't have information on them. It's a multitude of different things that go into lake health, but each one of these pieces can tell us a different part of that story. You're going to hear me talk a lot about trophic status tonight. Before I go into that, I wanted to just cover what I mean by trophic status. So New Hampshire has 3 different levels: oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic. When I talk about trophic status, that's basically just a descriptor for how much energy is moving around that system, or how productive that system is. And each level has a different level of productivity. So an oligotrophic lake, for instance, it's a low productive system. It doesn't have that much energy moving around it. So this means that it doesn't have much for plants, and it has very low algae levels. The water will probably be very clear. Whereas eutrophic lakes are high energy systems. There's a lot of energy going around. So they can have lots of plants, lots of algae, the water isn't as clear. Mesotrophic lakes are the most common in New Hampshire, and they're somewhere in between. So the reason I bring this up is to give you the description of what trophic status is, but also to emphasize that depending on what a lake's trophic status is, that's going to mean different things for what is healthy for that lake. So for instance, chlorophyll A, or algae abundance, may be at an unhealthy level if you were talking about an oligotrophic lake, but it would be perfectly fine and normal for a eutrophic lake. This report takes all that data that's been collected from 1991 to 2018 and looks at it in 3 different ways: current condition, long-term trend, and short-term changes. When I talk about current condition, what this means is we've aggregated all of our data, all of our lake data from 1991 to 2018. It doesn't matter which program it was collected under. We collect it all and break it up by its trophic class and create a frequency distribution graph. You can see an example of a frequency distribution graph at the right of the screen. So this basically takes all that information and allows you to calculate probabilities for each water body. So this helped us understand how well lakes were represented in each parameter. So if we were maybe over or underrepresented in a particular category. And this also, we were able to calculate these percentages for each water body, the 150 water bodies that we included in the report for each parameter. I have an example of this at the bottom of the screen. I pulled information for Massasecum Lake in Bradford. These are the different percentiles that Lake Massasecum has for each of the parameters we'll be talking about tonight. And this gets back to my point of how different parameters can tell us different things about a lake. So for instance, when we look at total phosphorus, Massasecum Lake has a total phosphorus percentile of 8.1. It's very low in the grand scheme of things. When you compare it to all other water bodies in the state that are in its trophic class, only about 8% of lakes are lower than it. However, when you look at water temperature, it's right around in the middle. So different parameters can reveal different information about individual water bodies. Long-term trends were the second thing that we looked at. So for each of those 150 lakes, we took an annual median from 1991 to 2018, and we looked at the trend, both for the individual water body and grouped them by their trophic class. We said that a trend was present when there was a less than 5% chance that what we were seeing was happening randomly. Lastly, we looked at short-term change. So this was only using data from 2009 to 2018. We split the data into a before and after group. So group 1 is from 2009 to 2013 and compared it to the second group of data from 2014 to 2018. And this was just looking at, is there a difference from the previous 5 years to the current 5 years? We considered this sort of as a warning sign. So potentially if a trend says that, nothing is happening, a parameter isn't changing at all, but then we see that there's been a significant change in the short-term analysis, then that might be an early warning sign that the lake is starting to move in a different direction for that parameter. So I'm going to jump right into those 5 parameters. And first we're going to talk about chlorophyll A, which is essentially a measure of algal abundance. This photosynthetic pigment can be affected by light, nutrient availability, and temperature. And we expect different levels of chlorophyll A depending on trophic status. So remember, getting back to the different energy levels, oligotrophic lakes are lower energy, so we would expect them to have low chlorophyll A concentration. Whereas eutrophic lakes that are the higher energy systems, we would expect to have higher levels of chlorophyll A, with mesotrophic lakes somewhere in between. Looking at the current condition, we had a pretty good spread of lakes all in different levels. So you can see we had a pretty even distribution between lakes on the really low end, lakes on the really high end, and anywhere in between. I've also provided the very lowest percentiles and the very highest percentiles on the right of the screen. These were the lakes that were the lowest or highest within their trophic class, just for people's curiosity. However, every lake that we analyzed in this report has those numbers calculated. When we looked at the long-term trend in chlorophyll A concentrations, we did not find any trends by trophic class. Looking at individual water bodies, we found about 4 times as many water bodies were showing significant decreases in chlorophyll A than increases. For short-term changes, there was a similar pattern where more lakes showed a decrease in the current group of data than the previous group So what's causing these changes? Typically, when we think of chlorophyll A, we think of it in association with total phosphorus, which is a limiting nutrient in our freshwater systems. When we have excess phosphorus in a system from things like pet waste or septic systems or lawn fertilizers, you can have an algae bloom. However, what we were seeing was more decreasing chlorophyll A over time than increasing. So what we think is going on is this phenomenon called lake browning. Now, this might be a new term that you haven't heard of before. It's fairly new in the literature. It's starting to pop up a lot more in the last few years. And lake browning is essentially describing increases in dissolved organic carbon, or DOC, in our water bodies. So if you can imagine that tea color that water will sometimes have, that's dissolved organic carbon influence that you're seeing. So as this dissolved organic carbon increases, water will get darker, and this is likely inhibiting light availability for algae, so that we're seeing decreases. Now, why DOC is increasing has been attributed to a couple different things, and it's not totally resolved which one is having more effect. DOC increases have been attributed to, one, acid rain recovery. So less pollution being rained down on our landscapes is changing chemistry in the forests, and as water falls on that and runs off into our water, it's picking up more DOC. Another hypothesis of why DOC is increasing may be due to increases in extreme weather events in the Northeast. So New Hampshire, in addition to getting wetter, is also having more rain fall in a shorter amount of time. And so these flashier systems are potentially picking up more debris as they come down and delivering that debris and hence that dissolved organic carbon to our lakes. I'm going to touch on lake browning again, but that's kind of the big reveal in as far as what lake browning is, and we can certainly talk more about it at the end of the presentation. Our second parameter is Secchi depth. Now, if you're not familiar with a Secchi disk, it is essentially looks exactly like this picture. It's quarters of white and black on a disc, and you attach it to a rope or a chain, and you lower it down into the water column until you can't see it anymore. And the depth that you've lowered it is your Secchi depth. It's essentially a measure of water clarity, and it can be affected by algae concentrations or sediment in the water column. Again, we would expect different levels depending on a water body's trophic class. So you remember those low productive systems, the oligotrophic systems, will have higher Secchi depth because there's less to block it as it moves down through the water column. Whereas the eutrophic, highly productive systems are going to have shallower Secchi depths because there's more algae there to block it. The lakes that were included in this report tended to be a little underrepresented on the low end. So lakes that were shallower, had shallower Secchi depth, were a little less common in our VLAP analysis than what we see in the background of New Hampshire water bodies. For long-term trends, we did find a decreasing trend for mesotrophic and oligotrophic water bodies. And when we looked at water bodies individually, we found many more water bodies were showing decreasing Secchi depth over time. And remember, decreasing means that the Secchi depth is getting shallower. When we looked at short-term changes, there was more of an even split and not as many water bodies showing any sort of change, which suggested that we're seeing more of a long-term change than short-term changes. So what's causing these changes? As I mentioned, typically when we think of what affects secchi depth, we think of either algae concentrations or sediment in the water column, which can be influenced by those excess nutrient loads or stormwater runoff. However, I am going to come back to the lake browning topic again. As I mentioned earlier, increases in DOC making water darker, they're inhibiting light availability, so it's harder to see that disk as it gets lowered down. Specific conductance is a measure of a water's ability to conduct electricity. This can be influenced by road salts, fertilizers, and natural geology. New Hampshire in general tends to have very low specific conductance. And we tend to start to see higher levels associated with urbanized watersheds and increased road density. We like to pay attention to this parameter, especially as it relates to road salt. So if you remember from way back in a chemistry class, road salt is made up of sodium chloride. So the same table salt that you have at home is also the same chemical composition often of what's applied to our roads. And the chloride half of that chemical composition can actually be toxic to aquatic life in high enough concentrations. So chloride is something that we like to pay attention to at the state for that reason. When we looked at the current condition, we did find we were overrepresented on the high end. So there were more lakes in VLAP that tended to have high specific conductance values when compared to the rest of the state, and not so much for lower values. Our long-term trends found that we had increasing trends for both mesotrophic and eutrophic classes. And when we looked at individual water bodies, more than 40% of our water bodies were showing increases in specific conductance over time. In addition to that being a fairly large number for long-term trends, when we looked at short-term changes, we found that nearly 80% of water bodies had higher specific conductance in the last 5 years when compared to the previous 5 years, which means that not only is this changing over the long term, it is a continually changing parameter, so it hasn't settled and is continuing to shift upward. What's causing these changes? We are attributing that largely to road salt influences. So millions of metric tons of road salt are used every year, and increasing chloride levels attributed to road salt have been documented throughout the Northeast. There's no natural process by which salt is broken down. So what that means is when salt gets scattered on a road or on a driveway or on your steps, that salt isn't going anywhere. It's not being taken up by plants. It's not converting into something else. So it's there until it joins the sediment and sediments out, or until it moves down to the ocean. We also know that salt can get introduced to our watersheds through water softeners, but we don't have a good sense of what the percentage of salt input is from those. And so this runs into the question, the balance of safety versus overuse. We do, of course, want people to be able to travel safely in the winter. However, there's many cases where salt is either over-applied or is not the best thing to use given the conditions. And so this is an area where a lot more work, I think, is needed as far as understanding when is the best case to use salt, how can it be used most effectively, and how can we still travel safely without spreading too much of this potential pollutant on our landscapes and waterscapes. Our next parameter is total phosphorus, which I mentioned earlier is a limiting nutrient for aquatic plants and algae. It's affected by natural background conditions, such as what type of geology you have in your watershed, but also can be influenced by watershed use, such as fertilizer application, septic system inputs, that sort of things. We do expect different levels depending on the trophic class, with oligotrophic lakes having lower levels and eutrophic lakes having higher levels. We were a little underrepresented on the high end for total phosphorus. So VLAP lakes tend to be lower in phosphorus when they're compared with data from all around the state. For long-term trends, we did find a significantly increasing trend for eutrophic lakes. However, when we look at individual water bodies, we found more decreasing water bodies than increasing. When we looked at short-term changes, there was a fairly even split and really not that many water bodies showing changes. So when we think of changes in total phosphorus, it's usually in the wrong direction. We think of total phosphorus coming in from our stormwater runoff, from our fertilizers, etc., which can fuel algae blooms. However, these, while it's not great that we saw an increase for eutrophic water bodies, we were pleased to see some of the decreases. And we would expect these decreases are likely associated with just better land management practices, such as the Shoreland Water Quality Protection Act, and people being smart about fertilizer use and leaving buffers in place and that sort of thing. Lastly, I'm going to talk about water temperature. Now, as you know, all lakes come in all different sizes and shapes, and I decided to look at data or water temperature from 1 meter below the surface only. So that way everything was standardized across all these different sized lakes. Water temperature can be affected by air temperature, water clarity, and global climate patterns. And it has a big effect on dissolved oxygen levels, as well as how energy moves around a water body. So when I looked at water temperature, we seem to be a little underrepresented both on the high and the low end. So the majority of VLAP lakes that we used in this trend report were somewhere in the middle. We did find a significantly increasing trend for mesotrophic and oligotrophic lakes. When we looked at individual water bodies, we found many more water bodies showing an increase over time versus a decrease. When we looked at short-term changes, there was very little activity, just 2 water bodies showing an increase, which suggests that what we're seeing is more of a long-term effect than something that's happening in the short term. So what is causing these changes? Well, we have had some increases in air temperature by approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. And I'm also going to come back to lake browning, again, because that increase in dissolved organic carbon can make water darker. That dark color will absorb the heat. And so both of these things may be having an influence, and we're not in a position to say, you know, which one is having a bigger influence than the other. So there's a lot of text on this summary slide, but this was just kind of the highlights of each parameter that I talked about. Chlorophyll A, so that algae concentration, more water bodies are decreasing than increasing. Our Secchi depth is decreasing or becoming more shallow for oligotrophic and mesotrophic lakes. Our specific conductance is increasing for oligotrophic and mesotrophic lakes, and appears to be a rapidly shifting parameter, more so than any of the other ones we looked at, with approximately 80% of water bodies showing an increase in the last 10 years. For total phosphorus, we did see an increase for the eutrophic class, but overall, relatively few individual water bodies showed changes. For water temperature, we did have a significant increase for oligotrophic and mesotrophic water bodies, and more water bodies showed increases than decreases. So coming back to that health question of how healthy are our lakes, I'd like to say the simple answer is they're mostly doing pretty well, but we are seeing changes and things are starting to shift. The biggest drivers of these change are lake browning. So those increases in dissolved organic carbon, making the water darker, it's having an influence on Secchi depth, it's having an influence on chlorophyll A concentration, it's changing how energy moves around our lakes. It's impossible to know whether it's due more to recovery from acid rain or from ongoing climate change. Both of these things have been kind of attributed to causing it. Secondly, salt. So big takeaway from that specific conductance section was that we expect that this increase in salt is primarily from road salt and continues to be a rapidly shifting parameter. And lastly, climate change. As I mentioned earlier, New England is getting warmer and wetter. However, when we say wetter, it can be more rain in less time. So it's just creating flashier systems where there's more likely flooding and then more likely debris being washed in during these events. I believe our extreme events have increased by like 70% in the last 60 years or so. I'll have to double check that, but we are starting to see how our rainfalls change. So I didn't want to leave you with wondering, well, what could I do to help? I always like to provide suggestions because there's always things that can be done. My biggest point that I wanted to give during this talk was to find ways to reduce salt use. So for me personally, that was probably the most shocking parameter, just to see how it's changing over the long term and over the short term. So learning more about when it's the best time to use salt, when it's not a good time to use salt, potentially, you know, if temperatures are really, really low, you know, sometimes the salt won't be able to get into liquid form at that point and it's just going to sit on top. That's an example, but I'll have a link at the end of the presentation that goes to more about learning the best times when to use salt. Shoreline buffers and stormwater management. So while the total phosphorus results and the chlorophyll A results seemed, you know, pretty good, we're seeing more decreases than increases. We want to continue emphasizing the importance of such things like protecting your shoreline buffers and getting your stormwater to infiltrate, not run off into your water body, especially with changing rain patterns. So I think people are probably doing really well with this, at least from the data. It looks like things are doing well, but it's a good thing to be aware of and know that keeping those plants along the edge and infiltrating your stormwater has some very positive effects on your lake. Volunteering. So this report and all this data would not have been possible without the hard work and effort of hundreds of volunteers in the VLAP program. Choosing to volunteer either for VLAP or another organization that you're potentially just interested in, makes a huge difference, and it really created some amazing results that we wouldn't have otherwise without that help. And lastly, supporting water and climate-friendly policies to help keep our lakes clean and healthy. And so, as I mentioned, I do have a list of different websites people can go visit. There's a link to this new trend report if you want to read it yourself or look at some of those other parameters that I mentioned at the very beginning, but we didn't have time to talk about tonight. There's also some information on reducing salt, stormwater management, and those sorts of things. And so with that, big thank you to everyone. And Dave and I will take any questions.
Well, thank you, Kirsten and Dave. That was very informative. I learned a lot. The first question is the report. Is it posted on the DES website somewhere where we can direct people to?
Yes, it is. And that last slide has a link to it. So
Okay, perfect.
here that's that link.
Perfect. Lots of people have been wondering that. I'll start off with just a few questions and then I will turn it over to Crystal. So dissolved organic carbon, lake browning. I know that's a new term for a lot of us today.
Yes.
And Drew was wondering, is this the same thing as tannins? You know, the pigments that make our lakes, some of our lakes darker. Is it related? Is it the same? Is it different?
Yeah, it's a component in that. Yeah, I think that tannins probably encompasses more than just DOC, but DOC is a part of, yes, that tannin influence. Exactly. That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Another question, also from Drew, is getting to your temperature readings. How were those temperature readings taken, continuously, like with some sort of meter, or were they, certain points in time? How many data points were looked at when you were looking at the temperature?
So those came from the VLAP monitoring visits, the biologist visits. So I had data from either 1 to 3 times each year, and then a minimum of 10 years for each individual lake.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the DO temperature probe, if they're not continuous monitoring, you do the hanging. Yeah, you take a reading every meter, and I just took the 1 meter mark. I didn't do anything lower than that.
Great. So sometimes in a summer you'd have, 3 readings for a lake, sometimes 1, but at least 1 data point per year over that 10-year period.
Yeah, at least 1. Yeah. And then a minimum of 10 years.
And a minimum of 10 years. Great.
And many of these lakes, had data over, 20, 25 years. So
That's
10
great.
is just the minimum.
Great. Let's see. Maybe I'll turn it over to Crystal, and she has, I know, a few questions queued up, and I'll continue monitoring the questions that come in.
A few questions. Well, people are really jazzed up about dissolved organic carbon and the concept of lake browning, which is funny because when I was younger, people used to call it tea colored and say that the lake is getting more tea colored. So I think that browning just seems like a more applicable term to use for it. But folks are interested in hearing a little bit more. Can lake browning be caused by soil erosion? And what are the greater implications of browning over time as a water quality indicator? Is it a bad thing? Or is it necessarily, good or bad, or just an indicator of lake aging?
Those are all really great questions. That's some really good information. And I think part of not quite knowing how to think about it is the 2 drivers of what they suspect is increasing dissolved organic carbon. One is a real positive. Recovery from acid rain is a great thing to hear, but on the flip side, it may be increasing due to changes in weather patterns. So that seems like more of a negative. So which is it? I don't think that it's a bad thing. I think that there's a very good chance that what we're seeing it's a recovery from acid rain. So what we know about DOC is as rain falls, the rate of DOC that's picked up and transported is influenced by the amount of pollutants in the rain particles. So the more acid, so those acid causing parameters that have historically fallen with the rain have decreased pH and also decreased the rate of DOC that's soluble, which just means it's not dissolving into the water, so it's not flowing into the water body. The reduction of those pollutants and the subsequent increase in pH is allowing more dissolved organic carbon to get taken up into the water and moved to the water body. So in some ways, it does seem like dissolved organic carbon and this darker water, it's not a bad thing. It's actually a recovery from these excess pollutants that we had until the implication of the Clean Air Act, which has helped reduce so much pollution.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, so I can understand, we tend to think of, okay, water is healthiest and best when it's really clear and you can see for meters, and, people, get understandably concerned, if they're noticing that their water isn't as clear as it used to be. And this is suggesting that might actually be moving back towards better health for that lake, which I know probably isn't a great thing for some people to hear. We do love our nice clear water, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. However, the flip side is, it could be that more organic matter is simply getting washed into water bodies with how things are becoming, they fluctuate higher. The rain coming in a shorter amount of time is washing more stuff in. That's potentially something that's going on too. And that gets at the importance of that stormwater management, getting water to infiltrate, making sure that, your leaves and whatever else aren't being, washed in whenever we have a big flashy rain event. Dave, did you want to contribute anything to this conversation?
Wow, Kirsten, I think you did a pretty excellent job.
Really
I
comprehensive.
I think I would have left it at, we're still learning a lot about these.
Well, that is it too. Yes, we
really are.
It's a new concept for us as well. We're trying to educate ourselves on it as well. And Sarah has recently started collecting color data on lakes, I think in the last couple years. So unfortunately, we don't have historical long-term color data sets. Now, when I talk about color, that's a little bit different than DOC, but it can be used as a proxy. DOC samples themselves are pretty expensive to run. So you'd need a lot of them to really figure out those long-term trends.
Well, great. I think, the takeaway that I got from all of that was that, lakes are an ecosystem. They're not just, I think that folks can get confused and sometimes think of them as this, containment of water that we swim and recreate in, when in actuality, they're a really complex system that is growing and changing. And we're just here, kind of studying it. So.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm realizing part of the question I didn't touch on was what does that mean for some of those parameters going forward? And that is something that I think research is still being done on. I think it is going to influence or change how energy moves throughout the lake. So light not penetrating as deeply into the water, kind of changing the temperature dynamics a little bit. It may change stratification, which is, the hot layer on top, the middle mixed layer in the middle, and then the bottom cold layer. It may shift kind of where that ends up throughout the summer. And yeah, I think just the energy dynamics and I don't think that we are the ones to speak for that, unfortunately. I think that the jury is still out with people conducting research about how exactly that's changing things.
All right, well, I know that we're getting a little short on time. We still have a lot of questions to get through. So I was hoping that I could just throw you folks a softball to speak to your Green Snow Pro program and how New Hampshire can reduce salt usage without sacrificing safety, and how we can get municipalities on board with decreasing their salt usage as well.
Yeah, and Dave, feel free to chime in on this one too, because I'm familiar with the Green Snow Pro program, but I don't work in it. So I know that it's a certification program, I believe done through UNH, and it allows salt applicators to learn how to better calibrate their machines and help reduce the amount of salt that gets put down on roads. And it's a voluntary program, but I believe there is some insurance associated with it that if you take this course, then you're not liable for those slip and fall cases that might be brought against you. So that was a big incentive for a lot of applicators.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I will just, I'll jump in and just add, Kirsten's right on the mark there. And I did see a couple of chat questions that came up about that for the local municipalities, and that's the best thing to do is to get the local municipality to participate in the Green Snow Pro program.
Excellent. Well, Andrea, I got momentarily kicked out of this earlier, so I realized I don't have the earlier chat, and I've run out of questions that I took notes on. So if there are any important things that we missed, feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through the chat box now, and I think we've hit the major ones. I would say at this point, we're up at a little after 8. If anyone has a burning question that somehow I missed, and you quickly type it in. But yeah, a lot of the questions were about salt. So we talked about the Green Snow Pro. Lots of people want to learn more about lake browning. So I'm hoping Kirsten and Dave, we can keep in touch with you guys and have you back as we learn more. And just to let people know, researchers around the country and even the world are looking at lake browning, and that was going to be one of the topics that was covered in our Lakes Congress annual meeting this past end of May by our keynote presenter. But obviously we didn't have that event. He is scheduled to come next year at the end of May to talk about the research in lake browning and some other stuff as well. So yeah, this is definitely on the radar here in New Hampshire, as well as with researchers nationwide. It's an interesting new potential condition for our lakes, as Kirsten was saying, the different dynamics it may play. So I'm quickly looking at the chat box. And it looks like we've gotten most of them. One last one about salt. What is the trend for salt consumption over the years? Drew, I think it's safe to say that in general, salt use is increasing in general as we're having more extreme weather events. We are actually having more ice, and more ice means that we need more de-icing agents out there. So it's potentially going up. And I know that a lot of we are seeing conductivity increase in a number of our lakes, which is an indicator that more salt is getting into our lakes. Dave, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Or Kirsten?
No, I think you hit it right on the nail. There's no question that the salt usage has gone through the roof.
Yeah, and just another thing to point out that we have such an increase in land use change. So more driveways and walkways and parking lots as people, come into the area and upgrade their camps from, their seasonal homes to year-round homes, and, having more businesses move into the area. That's certainly going to contribute to the increase in salt use that we're seeing as well.
Great. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I want to again thank all of you for spending your evening with us. Again, you will receive an email from me in just a few minutes letting us know. Please tell us how we did, what you liked, what we could have done better, and things you want to learn about in the future. And again, you'll receive another email from me tomorrow with links to this recording and also links to the report, and I'll throw in a link to the Green Snow Pro program as well. So before we leave, Dave and Kirsten, any last comments or things you want to share with the group?
I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their evening to come listen to us talk about water.
Just enjoy the outside and take care of our lakes.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Keep up the good work, and keep us posted and we're always looking to help you guys get the word out on your great work. So thank you.
Well, thank you for allowing us the opportunity.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
All right.
Be well.
Good night.
Good night.